Thank you very much. Barrett Wright, president of Hill Robinson USA, hillrobinson.com. Pleasure to speak with you. Hill Robinson celebrating its 20th anniversary, and you now 11 years with Hill Robinson, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And 7 years
Yes.
as president of Hill Robinson USA.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's been a whirlwind of an 11 years. A lot has changed in the past 5 years. So it's been, I think, a very dynamic experience so far. Plus, with all of the hurdles that we've been presented, with over the course of the last, 2 years, I think. So it's been some great problem solving.
Absolutely, and such an exciting time in general in the industry, yet further in your position, of course, use the word correctly, of course, challenging, and then also then segueing relatively quickly into one of the most exciting times in the industry, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it is. I mean, it's funny. I think COVID, for lack of a better explanation, was a kind of a good thing for yacht management.
Right.
I think we had a chance to sort of demonstrate the value added to the clients who do engage yacht managers. I know a lot of captains are suspicious, thinking that yacht managers are going to tell them what to do. But I've been really trying to emphasize that we're here to support you and here to really kind of do the homework, so that they get all of the information real time from a trusted source. And so with COVID, it was really put on us to make sure that the boats could transit to places without too much hassle, make sure that we're up to date with what was required to enter, each of the locations. And even to this day, we still have a weekly, fleet update with travel updates as to what's required in various locations around the world. And it is pretty global. A lot of it is based on where our boats have gone. But we keep that up to date, knowing that it's still, the pandemic is still very much alive. It seems to be cyclical now. It's never really going to be over. So we have to stick with that. And then, obviously now with, everything going on in Ukraine, there's a different, things that we have to pay attention to. The cost of fuel, is something that we really have to do and adjust budgets accordingly for that and to make room for that. So, it's kind of on to the next thing while, the pandemic is still there in the shadows.
Right, absolutely. And then, as you touched upon with respect to what Hill Robinson does, and yes, COVID being cyclical, yet it then is cyclical in different ways in so many of the different ports with respect to the yachts and where you're going to. In the BVI, where they handle, however you want to say, their approach to COVID is much different than just down the street, so to speak, in the U.S. Virgin Islands or whatnot. And so then that must be interesting with respect to managing that and how it can change to a certain extent in certain countries on a weekly, if not monthly basis, just depending on where news is coming from and whatnot.
It is, and I think working for a company that's based out of Monaco with offices throughout Europe and into Australia plus here, I think that we've got the most flexible guidelines right now. Say what COVID, that's so like 2021.
Right.
And you kind of look at in Florida in particular.
Yeah.
But right now, we're seeing that there's an increase in cases in New York City and in Philadelphia. So now they're talking about reinstating masks in restaurants again. But it's been great because over the course of the last 4 weeks, we've finally gotten a number of our colleagues from Europe who've been able to come into our Florida office and, actually sort of get to know everybody. My team has doubled in size since the start of COVID.
Wow.
And a lot of the people that are sort of heading up the various departments are also new, within the last 2 years. So not really being able to see each other face to face and, being able to show them, what goes on here. And it's a very different, I think it's a very different personality, for lack of a better word, than what sort of seen, I think, in Europe and even down in Australia. It's kind of a little bit more of let's make it work. Whatever we're going to have to do to get there, let's just do it. So, and I think it's I think because we are not so push down on regulations and things. I think we've made that next step and that next jump. I've got all of my team back in the office again. We just signed, another lease on an office, and blew a hole through it, which you can hear in the background. I'm sorry. But, that's a great thing to me. We're all, all systems go and, moving ahead. So it's good. It's nerve-wracking, waiting for the next thing to come down. But I think it's exciting. It's a sign that, we're holding our own.
Absolutely. Well, more than holding your own. More than holding your own.
Mhm.
I have, if you don't mind, I wanted to read this fantastic quote from the Hill Robinson website. Then we can segue into the next questions. Is begin quote: "The best advice that I have received as a yacht owner was to employ Hill Robinson as a manager when I acquired my first yacht. They went on to supervise the construction of my present yacht and manage it since delivery. The most frequent comment I receive is that my 12-year-old yacht looks like a newly built yacht, which is the result of Hill Robinson's extraordinarily diligent, dedicated, and professional management." And I wanted to read that because I think that quote itself speaks volumes about Hill Robinson and what it is that you do and what it is that you have done for the past 20 years, how you've evolved or continue to evolve and then evolved significantly or in an accelerated way over the past 5 years, as you put it. And as Paul Cook says, 20 years ago, Hill Robinson was specifically created to manage the complexity of the world's largest yachts, bringing technical experience to a full spectrum of services that owners require most. And I would imagine that many yacht owners, when they first perhaps begin delving into yacht management, or it perhaps starts with just having a company, many of them out there, to simply handle the charter of the yacht. But what Hill Robinson does is on a completely different playing field.
Yeah, I mean, we always encourage full management, and I think in particular for first-time yacht owners, it is a good thing, even if it's just for the first 12 months and then they hand it off to a family office or something. But there are so many regulations. There's so many acronyms. There are so many things that aren't fully considered. A sales broker may say one thing and they could be off by a zero, which is significant in stuff. So I always like to tell people there's for us coming in, at least to settle the crew, I think the biggest challenge obviously is handling crew, finding the right crew. I would say that is many of the owners' biggest frustration. So, we look at trying to find, the best complement of crew that matches the type of service the owner is looking for, the type of program he or she is looking to run, and as well as, just their personalities, making sure that everything jives. There's a very different relationship between American owners and their captains versus, let's say, Middle Eastern owners and their captains, or European owners and their captains. So,
right.
There's all these different dynamics that we have to take into consideration. And I think with, Hill Robinson really being a global company now, speaking over 35 languages and things, and being aware of, regionalism, being aware of different cultures, we're able to really help with that. And then I think more importantly, when it comes to ownership of boats, there's invariably a circumstance that's going to come up on, one of our fleet boats that we've already experienced on another, or a version of it. And so we can sort of pull all of our resources together, pull that experience together, and, find a solution to a problem, or be able to head off a potential problem, which I think is even more important.
Right.
I think the better thing too is, at least in my U.S. office, and I know for a lot of the team, we do have onboard experience. We have been crew members, so we're able to be empathetic to the stress that comes with having guests on board. We're able to understand sort of limitations of where in the world somebody might be. I've thrown my employees on a plane with suitcases full of specific water to be delivered to a faraway place, and it's just needed. We'll make it work. So I think we do go above and beyond, but I think that excuse me, that network is huge, and I just think that there's always a willingness to say yes, or try to figure out how to say yes, rather than just saying no, it's not possible, it's not. And it's like, well, there's some way that we can get it to work that's gonna be usable, and at least get us as close to satisfying everybody as we can. And I think that's a challenge, and that's something that I find to be very I get a kick out of it. It's kind of a high. You've got some bad days where there's disagreements and people are unhappy and things just aren't going right. But when you're able to pull the seemingly impossible together and make it work, that's just something that keeps you going for months afterwards. And it's always possible. We'll all work out in the end. It might not be the exact way you wanted it, but something will be figured out. So I think that's huge. And I think with the team and the experience that everybody has, the connections that everybody has, the relationships that everybody has, when you sign on for management, clients benefit from all of that.
Right.
And it is pretty in depth. Mm-hmm.
And it must also be interesting, going back to in correlation with, you mentioned the intricacies, so to speak, of when you're choosing or creating a team for a yacht. And then, so, the captain at the top, but then also I would imagine, especially with respect to in correlation with COVID, so not only is, where primarily is the yacht going to be based, but then also as far in advance, perhaps, where is the yacht going to be traveling? And then what crew will work best in those scenarios based on what they're adapted to, what they're used to, et cetera, correct?
Yep, no, absolutely. I think we try to have sort of a meeting with the owners. We start planning the budget for the next fiscal year, or the next operating year, 3 or 4 months in advance. And some owners actually like to sit down and have a meeting and say, this is what my planned itinerary is for the year. This is, we're going to be here, we're going to be there. And I mean, some, will cover 17,000 miles, in a particular year, which is incredible.
Yeah.
I've had some boats that I've lived vicariously through them, and kind of get little sweet treats that come from wherever in the world they happen to be, like the monkey boot coffee, and things like that are just funny, but we get to experience that through the crew, and we're actually now trying to encourage people to send us photos of where they are, to have them up on the wall and just understand where they're helping them out. But with regards to crew, obviously being able to go places is one consideration, and during COVID, trying to bring crew in and out of the United States was one thing. You have to have a mandatory B1. We couldn't make anything else work. Travel in and out of the States was very, very limited. So, you had to be a seafarer to be able to come in, and the proof of the documentation for that. But then furthermore, having crew members who B1 visa ran out while they were here, how many times can we apply for an extension without them having to repatriate themselves somewhere else and re-enter?
Right.
And then also visas just, flat out expiring and not being able to get the crew to an embassy in order to get that visa renewed. All these things that were just, you take for granted until you can't get it done.
Right.
We're kind of used to just making it happen. And so that was, furthermore creativity, and it was really kind of just the network. Okay, that doesn't work, and say, well, okay, Madrid's the one right now that's accepting, emergency visas, so let's send everybody there. And then, oh, no, that's dried up now, so we're going to go over to Croatia. We know that they're doing everything there. So it was really amongst, what the fleet was experiencing, being able to share that amongst the yacht managers, and then with all the captains, we were able to make it as efficient as possible. And then obviously, handling crew who were based in New Zealand and Australia, that was a whole other element of choreography, for lack of a better word. I still have some crew members who haven't been home in almost 3 years,
Wow.
Because they haven't made it, and with having to spend time in quarantine previously, it just made it hard for them. So, it's offering a little bit of, I think, emotional support to them too, understanding that they can't get home.
Of course, which I'm sure is also a component of what Hill Robinson is this, based on everything that you said, and woven within it is, it's a huge family with respect to everyone that's involved, and then not only in general with respect to the dynamics of the company, but then managing each of these unique scenarios and ensuring that each person is adequately prepared for what's coming their way, whether it be with COVID or you touched upon, Ukraine, et cetera, whatever is next coming down the pipeline.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think we have to. And I think, what I try to encourage all of my, team members to have is to really sort of get on board the boats when they are in town, when they are local, invite yourself down, have lunch with the crew, sit down in the crew mess, chat with everybody, and kind of, pick up a little bit of the dynamics, but also pick up some of the things that, are bothering them, things that are, concerning to them, and being able to try and, help out or alleviate, any concerns. I think, crew members who, need to go home because they need to have surgery, how are we going to help them out with that? Crew members who need to go home because a loved one is sick, being able to just offer, that kind of support when, particularly during COVID, they couldn't get back, or it was, it going to take a long time for them to get back. It was really being able to try and to help them out there and make it not as bad I think, for lack of a better word. So, like I say, I try to tell, sort of having a nice relationship with the deckhand to me is equally as important as having a great relationship with the captain or the chief officer, even the engineers, even, the most junior stewardesses, all the way through the chief stew pursers. You really, it makes a big difference when you're able to get on board and say, hey, Johnny Deckhand, great to see you.
Absolutely.
And, it does, I think, get their attention, and it does leave, I think, an impression. We just had a crew event where we had launched our HR Elite, the Academy, and the instructor had been training with us, and then we hosted this event in the evening, and while everybody was walking in, he greeted them all in sort of individually, and then just sort of sat in the corner and was kind of looking at everybody. And when he came to make his introduction, he said, "Good evening," all 21 people by their first name. And I mean, that had people at hello like that. So I really think that, taking the time to, as people are signing on, you look at their passport photo and you look at your name, and then when you see them on board the boat, I think it is, at least a nice gesture, I think, to at least be able to address them, when you get on and say, yeah, I know you, welcome, or whatever. So, I think that attention to detail is huge.
Absolutely.
And again, it's based on relationships.
Absolutely. Speaking of events, and also to weave it into my next question, I wanted to ask you about this magnificent yacht that you manage as well. How was, for Hill Robinson, the very successful Palm Beach International Boat Show, and specifically at the show, of course, the amazing yacht Bold?
When you have a boat like that that's at, a great show like Palm Beach, what's not to be successful? And add to it the most beautiful weather that I've ever seen in, South Florida over the course of the 4 days. You couldn't have had a better, round of circumstances. It was really, it's quality clientele that were coming through. I think it's one of the most accessible shows where, everybody's happy to pause and have a chat, whereas some of the other shows, it's so transaction geared that, nobody really wants to talk about, what's going on, or even, gossip, for lack of a better word, because they're so focused on that sale. Whereas with the Palm Beach show, it has almost a little bit more of a boutique atmosphere, and it just really is, people are so much more approachable. With a boat like Bold, you can't let everybody on. So, even if somebody comes up and says, oh, I want to get on this boat, it's like, well, unfortunately, for lack of a better word, you're not qualified. Are you in the market to charter this boat or not? But you still need to give those people, I think, a little bit of attention, answer their questions, and just sort of, and it makes, I think, a good impression, because actually somebody can come up that you would never in 1,000 years think has any sort of, business with a boat like that, and then you realize that, oh, well, their best friend just may be a person who's there, or they may be working for a person who is fully a potential client for that boat. So to me, you kind of learn a little bit of lessons to pay attention, and each person's a little bit different, and you listen to some of the questions and what they observe, and you have to converse with them in order to figure that stuff out. But
absolutely.
Kids come on, they love it, and these little kids are like, there's a helicopter, can we go look at it? And you're like, well, yeah, we're gonna sneak you on, and here's a picture in the helicopter, and then we'll sneak you off, that kind of stuff. So, that leaves great impressions, and I think everybody just enjoys that. Not to mention dogs at the boat show. Who doesn't love a good dog?
Absolutely, I have two of my own. And I believe it was the captain of Bold said it's more of a tool than a yacht.
Mm-hmm. No, I think so. I think the one thing that people like to hear is, where does it go? And being able to say, where doesn't it go? I think is the better question. What don't you want to do? This boat can do that. And I think it opens people's minds a little bit, because it's a boat that doesn't really look like anything that you would expect. It's not a white boat, it's like a destroyer sitting in the middle of Palm Beach. Well, what is that?
Right.
And so I think it opens people's eyes to what is possible. And I attended the Mare Forum just before the Palm Beach Boat Show, and we were talking about encouraging the next generation, the young 20-somethings, young 30-somethings, these app developers and stuff who have enormous amount of liquid wealth right now. And, they want to do things that are good for the environment. They want to do, things that are good for humanity and that kind of stuff. And I think, where design is going these days, and actually seeing something like that, at a boat show, being able to show it, sort of encourages that a little bit more. And of course, there's certainly plenty of the boats there for the people who like the more traditional side of things, love the summer in the Med, the winter in the Caribbean, that kind of stuff. There's certainly nothing wrong with it, but then, there are options for people who want to go farther afield, and how can they do that? And, particularly if disaster strikes in one location, and how can they get there and how can they help? Those sort of things are serious considerations for, I think, the next generation of yacht client.
Right, absolutely. And that is something that is a consistent theme that I have had mentioned to me during this podcast with other yacht brokers and whatnot, in that one of those many silver linings now, I think it's safe to say, with respect to COVID, is, as it pertains to the industry, is the dynamics of the demographics and how they've changed with respect to both yacht charter and yacht purchases with respect to a younger generation. I mean, across the board, of course, still the older generation, but then a younger generation that is also, because it just gave everyone, especially just for the sake of this conversation, the affluent, this opportunity a forced opportunity to realize that this is my one life. It is precious, and now is the time to live it. And one of the greatest ways to experience it and live it, regardless of how you want to do it, is with a yacht.
No, you can go places, farther afield. And I think with people being so, environmentally conscientious now, and sustainability being such a thing, you can kind of offset the idea that, you put bottom paint on a boat that's designed to kill every organism that touches it. But then, you've got boats now with these really dynamic, power plants, that can really reduce, their carbon footprint. And of course, with things like carbon offset, you can, offset what the consumption is by, planting trees or contributing towards, wind, power or anything like that in developing countries. So, there are other ways that you can, I think, reduce that. And I think people are interested, in how to do that. Again, like you look at Venus, she's run by apps, that kind of stuff. And we've had a few other boats that are, completely run by applications, and,
Amazing.
kind of, God forbid, the internet goes down or something happens, and, you can't get back there. But it's really dynamic. And I think there's always somebody who's going to be forward thinking. And, people are now thinking of, submersible yachts, kind of like the Nautilus, so it's, I don't know. I think it's a really dynamic time, and I think, much like, I think the art industry is seeing, there's always going to be the next generation, and you always want to cultivate that next generation, because, case in point, today's smallish, yacht owner might be tomorrow's big boat, owner. So, you kind of got to keep fostering that with the generations, and I think it's up to everybody in the industry to pay attention to how it's evolving, how people are evolving, and how design's evolving.
Absolutely. Very well said. You're very well spoken, by the way. Thank you very much. And speaking of, and then I will let you get going, because I've already had the opportunity to have almost 30 minutes of your time, which I'm so grateful for. Something that Natalia wanted me to touch upon, and I think this segues perfectly from what we were just discussing, is Hill Robinson's new build and refit project management.
Yeah, me personally, out of my office, I don't have a lot of the new build experience, but that's why I've got, Kevin Lafferty, who I can say, passing over to you, and hey, Kevin, go ahead as director of projects. So gotcha. We work, I think, very well on that front. What I don't know, he invariably does. But when it comes to refits, I've got an office that's in Palm Beach and the Wright shipyard that's devoted to refit, that's devoted to technical support. And we also have a presence up in the Savannah Yacht Center up there, which is now a place that can actually accommodate, really large vessels, within the United States. And it's one of the only places that can. with their synchro lift and with the graving dock. So all of a sudden we've opened it up, significantly the market up to 65 meters and plus, being able to come out of the water. So,
Wow.
we've really seen that market emerge. In the States over here, we don't see so much of, I think those significant refits where, they're, we'll add on, additional room to the transom, or we'll tear out all of the interior. But, with regards to a complete transformation of a boat, I don't think that you see that so frequently here, and people will elect to go back to the builder normally, in Europe, to undertake something like that. But, I things are still, churning out in the Westport. Delta is still busy up in the Pacific Northwest, and I've been into those shipyards, and I've done actual refit work at Delta, and I think they're up to snuff, and they're different from Europe, but they're no less capable. And I think now that we do have the facilities are starting to be built here, at least on the east coast of the U.S. and the Southeast, I really hope that we see a little bit more of the big boats come over and consider, the U.S. as a destination for refit. All the more considering the cost of the fuel, all the more considering exchange rates and things like that for particularly American owners. I really hope that we see an increase in refit activity over here.
Absolutely.
I'd like to see it.
And Barrett, now that we're already in April, unbelievably so, thus the year, and we may as well start saying Merry Christmas now and just cut to what do, at this moment, April 2022, and I always find it interesting. So a week ago, there's that brief moment where you can think, okay, it's the beginning of the month. It kind of just gives you that sense of, okay, it's the beginning of the month. I can breathe for a moment. And now we're already a third of the way through the month. But
tax season, it's here. Income taxes are due like Friday, Thursday.
Right.
Goodness gracious.
Oh, that. I call it extension season. So this moment, April 2022 versus April 2021, which is also very exciting. Obviously, April 2020 was what it was. But this moment in time, April 2022, as you look forward into the rest of 2022, what excites you in this present moment most about the upcoming months for Hill Robinson?
I think where I'm sitting, the one thing being in the U.S. and sort of, with the Bahamas being, a little bit more accessible, and with the Caribbean certainly being more accessible, I'm just excited by the fact that, we are kind of getting back to a little bit more of the business as usual. I think the Mediterranean's also looking at a great season because people are ready to travel again, and we're all ready to do something, regardless of what winds up coming in the next wave of COVID or the next version of it, for lack of a better word. But I just think that to me, despite everything going on in the world, I think people are excited. I think people want to do things, and after so much, I think, melancholy and things like that, and still the horrific things that are going on in Ukraine, I think the average person is looking for something to be excited about. And even in the U.S., excuse this background noise. I'm excited by my new office. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but I think people are still hopeful, and I think that people want to do things that are going to be fun. That they can kind of put the pause button on worry for a little while and look to something that's going to be a great experience, or something they haven't done in a long time. Getting together with family, all of that stuff's just starting. So I think there's a whole lot of uncertainty as to what the rest of the year is going to hold, between the U.S. economy and between obviously Ukraine and things. But I think that people are excited that they can move around again. I think people want to experience things again, and I think they are looking forward to doing it without a whole lot of worry. And if that's going to be in the short term, that to me is something. But I don't think people are as scared, to look forward to doing something. My mom's in the travel business, the custom travel business, and she had people sort of hedging on whether or not they wanted to do something for 2022. when they were rescheduling from last year, but now people really, her phone's ringing again. People are wanting to go places. They're wanting to get out of the U.S. and, getting to go to the Monaco show last year was just, it was awesome. Just nice getting out of here, getting able to see people again. It was huge. I went through the Heathrow airport with, my husband and I being the only people on the bus and the only people going through customs and security, which will never happen again in my lifetime. So that was a really cool
Right.
experience. But, I'm looking forward to people moving around. Spring break has been a great, period here in South Florida.
Yeah.
And I just think people want to do things again. They're tired of doing nothing. So
Very well
we're
said.
going to benefit from that.
Very well said. And I agree with you 100%. I think that regardless of the next variation, whatever you want to call it, of COVID or whatever's going on in the world, I think that another silver lining of COVID is overall, I think it did make people, regardless of where they're at in life, et cetera, it just, at their core, it made them more, I think, a forced positivity, a forced hopefulness. I think being forced to look at, regardless of what's going on, what is the good? Because there is always good, and there is always something great that I as a person can do, whether it is chartering a yacht or with Hill Robinson, whatever it might be. And I think that, again, that's another strong, very positive from COVID. Another silver lining, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that with the vaccination, I don't think people are as scared of COVID. It's not like you're necessarily going to wind up, in the hospital if you're exposed to it. Some people are like, oh, I'll get the sniffles or maybe lose my sense of smell for a little while, but it comes back. And so I think that it's not as a terrifying concept, anymore with the vaccination. So I think that's another thing that sort of alleviated some people's worries a little bit.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well said also. Barrett, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything that we didn't touch upon before I let you get going?
No, I think we covered the gamut.
All right. Well,
it was great talking to you. It was really, it was good. The questions asked kind of gave me, pause and a real good chance to sort of assess things in real time.
Fantastic.
Particularly on a Monday morning, it's kind of refreshing.
Monday morning.
A couple of challenges this morning, and it's not so bad overall.
Construction going on as well. Still nailed it.
I know. I'm so sorry for the background.
Nothing to apologize for. It's great.
Yeah.
Barrett Wright, President, Hill Robinson USA, hillrobinson.com. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope we get to do this again soon, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a fantastic week.
Thank you, Judd. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.